B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, August 25th, 2020. And as the Trump show debuts on a television network or a computer near you, we'll get around to the Republican National Convention, such as it is. But first, some important coverage of the Democrats. Today, I'm releasing a fresh, in-depth interview with reporter Patrick Martin. He writes for the World Socialist website, and he returns in 2018. He shared with us his reporting, which showed that the Democrats have made a conscious effort to recruit candidates for the House of Representatives with strong backgrounds in military and intelligence fields. And they're doing it again. 11 of those spies and soldiers got elected to the House in 2018. Those 11 are up for re-election, and there are more in the pipeline. And I really appreciate the work that Patrick has done, because in our hour-long conversation, he thumbnails virtually all of the candidates who are running this year who have these kinds of backgrounds. And because it's a growing trend, and because, in my observation, the Democratic Party has moved sharply to embrace the Pentagon, to embrace the intelligence community, particularly over the boondoggle of Russiagate, and because it is reflected in legislation, in support, for example, for regime change in Venezuela, the recent false reporting about Russia paying bounties to Taliban fighters to kill Americans in Afghanistan, which led to some dramatic legislation, which was co-sponsored by one of the sitting members of the House who has a military background. That's Jason Crow of Colorado. So, here's an excerpt from today's conversation with reporter Patrick Martin.
This year, it's about the same number of candidates on the ballot, but 11 of them are running as incumbents because they won their seats in 2018. Then there are another 23 who are challenging Republicans based on the handicapping by the organizations that do this for a living, such as the Cook Political Report. About a half a dozen of these 23 are favored to win seats, which means that the number of CIA Democrats in the House would rise to as many as 20, depending upon a few marginal calls.
That's journalist Patrick Martin, who is sharing with us his reporting on this fresh group of recruits from the military and intelligence communities by the Democrats to run for election to the House. And while I have many points of agreement with Patrick Martin, we don't always agree, and you'll hear that in the interview. And one of the people who he profiles, and he tended to agree with me when I called it out, is a candidate in the 11th District of North Carolina, one Morris Davis. Now, Mo Davis is a colonel in the Air Force, I believe. He served at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and he resigned in protest as the chief prosecutor when they told him he had to use evidence derived from torture, and when they told him that there would be no acquittals in these kangaroo courts at Gitmo. And I separate Colonel Davis. He is a 25-year veteran of the military, and he certainly fits in this category. But compared to the others who I have had no contact with, my contact with Mo Davis indicates that he is a man of principle. And as you'll hear in the interview, I describe his generalized support during the court-martial of then Bradley Manning, objecting to his being charged under the Espionage Act. Colonel Davis supports whistleblowers. He's one himself. And he's opposed to domestic surveillance, just to name a few issues that I respect him for. So I think you'll find it an interesting conversation. And in the show file for the interview podcast, I will be linking to the 2 articles that Patrick Martin has written, and we generally go down the line in the order that he covered in his reports. So if you want to just glance through there and find out if there is a military or spy recruited to run for Congress in your district or your state, that will make it easier. And we do cover the entire country in our conversation. There really are just a handful of states that don't have these types of veterans either serving now or running. So I'm catching up on a couple of articles that are critical of Democrats before we get that convention bounce and all kinds of people move on. Now, I have 5 quick stories for you here. One is written by Keaton Wise at the blog DoDissidents.com. And he makes an important set of comments and criticisms of former President Obama's speech at the Democratic Convention last week. And he cites some of the remarks that Obama made that I think are persuasive to some of the people who voted for Trump in 2016. Obama said, "I understand why many Americans are down on government. The way the rules have been set up and abused in Congress make it easy for special interests to stop progress. Believe me, I know. I understand why a white factory worker who's seen his wages cut or his job shipped overseas might feel like the government no longer looks out for him, and why a black mother might feel like it never looked out for her at all. I understand why a new immigrant might look around this country and wonder whether there's still a place for him here, and why a young person might look at politics right now, the circus of it all, the meanness and the lies and crazy conspiracy theories, and think, what's the point?" Well, Wise responds, "Factory workers do feel betrayed. Black people in general have good reason to think the government never cared about them, and it stands to reason that new immigrants would feel unwelcome given the current administration's overt hostility toward them. Obama's explanation for why young people have grown jaded, however, is far less convincing. In fact, it's completely made up. As a fairly young person myself," he writes, "who discusses current affairs on a literal daily basis, I can assert with great confidence that young people today aren't bitter about politics because the circus, the meanness, the lies, crazy. They're bitter because of the failed presidency and tone-deaf post-presidency of Barack Obama." Later, Mr. Wise responds to the comment about many young people down on government. He said it's not because politics is too mean or too circus-like, or that there are too many conspiracy theories. It's because young people invested their hopes in Barack Obama, and he failed them. And while his assessment of youth apathy and cynicism was undoubtedly deceptive, he said, "This paragraph is pure Orwellian propaganda," and here it comes. I'm quoting Obama now. "Here's the point. This president and those in power, those who benefit from keeping things the way they are counting on your cynicism. They know they can't win you over with their policies, so they're hoping to make it as hard as possible for you to vote, to convince you that your vote does not matter. That's how they win. That's how they get to keep making decisions that affect your life." And Wise says, first, the premise is false. Anyone with any political understanding knows there's bipartisan consensus in Washington that serves to protect and maintain the status quo. To classify this president and those in power as the sole beneficiaries of keeping things the way they are is simply dishonest. Obama's subsequent claim that Republicans seek to depress and suppress the vote is fair enough, but of course Democrats have their own underhanded means of protecting their power, just as Republicans do. He goes on to say, "The only real difference between Republicans and Democrats is that Republicans sell despair and the Democrats sell false hope. Republicans overtly encourage people to shun civic responsibility altogether and to think only of themselves, whereas Democrats manipulate their base into participating in masturbatory dead-end exercises of meaningless civic engagement." Powerful stuff, but I hope it provokes you to think a little bit critically about Obama and the general posture of Democrats. And this leads me to a stunning poll published by Gallup this week. The highest level of response to the question, which best describes your view of Trump and Biden? Both would be a good president. Neither would be a good president. Only Trump or only Biden? Well, the highest level of people selecting neither in polling history is shown here. 25% say neither. And when you poll Democrats, it's 19%, but independents say that at the rate of 37%. And this is the equivalent of giving people the choice of voting for none of the above. And it shows the deep dissatisfaction that people have with the choices that we face and the lack of confidence, particularly in Joe Biden as the challenger to the incumbent Trump. Also, this had escaped my notice, and let me confess that I did not read the Democratic platform. I consider those documents quite meaningless. They're aspirational. They're used to recruit different segments of the voting population, but they're not binding. And so I learned from Forbes magazine, from a writer who is clearly a supporter of fracking, nuclear energy, and any kind of energy exploitation, Robert Bryce, that after 48 years, 2020's Democratic platform endorses nuclear energy. Marks the first time since 1972 that the party has said anything positive in its platform about nuclear energy. And this guy, what's his name, Bryce? Yeah, Robert Bryce. He injects his opinion in what is allegedly a news article at Forbes, the capitalist tool. He says the change in policy is good and long overdue news for the American nuclear energy sector, and for everyone concerned about climate change. And as you may know, I do not think that even maintaining the current fleet of nuclear reactors is a decent response to climate change. We still have to deal with the nuclear waste and the risk of a catastrophic accident. So this is a major shift. And, of course, we didn't see any media coverage of it last week during the Democratic Ghost Convention. And this is a fairly simple report from Bonnie Christian, published at The Week on August 19th. And Bonnie sums it up, that the support that Biden has received from neoconservatives, the current posture of Donald Trump and his minions, highlight an increasingly undeniable fact of American politics 2020. The anti-war wing of both major parties is dead. Your presidential choice is between war and war. There's no faction of Republicans or Democrats which combines real power with a durable principled interest in turning American foreign policy away from global empire. And today at Minpress News, Catherine Shihada, that's correct, she reports that Linda Sarsour has received a private apology from the Biden campaign. And Sarsour is controversial. She is a pro-Palestinian activist. She was defined as anti-Semitic when she was booted out of the organizing committee of the annual Women's March on Washington. And she's tagged as anti-Semitic primarily because she supports boycott, divestment, and sanction aimed at Israel, the dreaded BDS. And I support BDS. Now, I believe that Linda Sarsour has made some comments that some people find offensive or intemperate. My point is not to defend every word she has said. But she was attacked because she was somehow involved peripherally in the Bernie Sanders campaign. And a Biden spokesperson said Joe Biden's been a strong supporter of Israel and a vehement opponent of anti-Semitism his entire life. He obviously condemns her views and opposes BDS, as does the Democratic platform. She has no role in the Biden campaign whatsoever. So Tony Blinken, who's described as Biden's top foreign policy advisor, told a group of activists, historically, Republicans and Democrats have been quick to dismiss Muslim, Arab American, and especially Palestinian American voices, and I want to reiterate on behalf of all of us our support for your communities. Now, that's not a direct apology. And then Simone Sanders, a former Bernie Sanders campaign advisor back in 2016, who joined the Biden team this cycle, said, "That's not how we do business. We are not in the business of condemning people in large swaths of the community. Absolutely not. We're going to do better going forward. This will not be a situation that will happen again." But if you believe in platforms, the Democratic platform is flatly opposed to BDS. Even though 70% of American adults are against anti-boycott measures, and over half of Democratic voters say that BDS is a legitimate movement. This one is a curious head-scratcher. And Linda Lewis, who helps us every day with our COVID-19 update, she flagged this and posted it on Facebook last night. It's an article from The Hill, the political media platform, reporting that Cyrus Vance Jr., the Manhattan District Attorney, on Monday agreed to delay enforcement of the subpoena that he's fought so hard for, which grants him the right to get a hold of 8 years of Trump's tax returns for the investigation of financial fraud. And again, there is no explanation offered so far, and Linda cited USA Today has a brief story about this, but I didn't see it in my survey of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other media outlets today. Vance has agreed to temporarily shelve the subpoena against Trump and his accounting firm, Mazars USA, allowing for another round of litigation. Now, why would he want that? This is bizarre. He's been supported by the Supreme Court that said Trump is not immune. He's gotten support from appeals courts. And now he is unilaterally backed off. Hey, Cy, I think you owe us some explanation. A Day 2 article on the appearance of Postmaster General Louis DeJoy before the House Oversight Committee on Monday, and Katie Porter, a California Democrat who can be quite feisty, asked DeJoy a trick question. He asked her how much it cost to mail a letter first class today. He got that one right, 55 cents. And he conceded that he didn't know the cost of sending a postcard today. That is 35 cents. And DeJoy defended himself, "I'll submit that I know very little about postage stamps." He also said he was unaware of how many people voted by mail in the last election, even as he pledged that the Postal Service has the capacity to safely deliver ballots. It was 31 million in 2018. And Porter shot back, "I'm glad you know the price of a stamp, but I'm concerned about your understanding of this agency. I'm concerned about it because you started taking very decisive action when you became Postmaster General." And with a tip of my ever-present hat to Dick Atlee, he shared a email that's being circulated that is attributed to an unnamed postal worker who wants you to know 4 things about your post office. Number 1, it's the only government agency that isn't funded by taxpayer dollars. That means the money we take home in our paychecks was made by us at USPS. Our money we take home is not your tax dollars, unlike every other government agency job. Our benefits and pay were made by us. We aren't funded by people's taxes. I've seen some people say we waste taxpayers' dollars, not sure how, when we're not even funded by tax dollars. Number 2, the post office is the only delivery service required to deliver to every single address in the United States, even if we take a loss. It's in the Constitution. We are a service to every American address in the country, DHL, FedEx, UPS do not deliver to every address. Most homes and businesses in rural areas only get delivery service from the post office. Number 3, the Postal Service is the only government agency in business that's been mandated to contribute $5.5 billion a year to our retiree benefits fund, 75 years into the future. This was passed in 2006, and most people don't know this about the Postal Service. We are funding a fund for employees of USPS that aren't even born yet. And there's over $200 billion in this fund. It's a big reason why on the books USPS has been losing money. And the fourth point, we have the cheapest rates compared to our competition. The post office has to go through the government to increase prices. USPS has tried numerous times to increase prices, but the government always tells us no. All other delivery services get to determine their prices without having to go through government. So those are all accurate points. And I hope that it informs you rather than some of the attacks and counterattacks that we're hearing in the media right now. Well, the streets of Kenosha, Wisconsin, faced their second night of angry protest on Monday, and the governor of Wisconsin, Democrat Tony Evers, has promised to move forward with reforms to curb law enforcement misconduct. He's called a special session for the legislators starting next week, August 31st, to consider a set of 9 police reform bills which were floated more than 2 months ago. We're learning that Jacob Blake, the black man who was shot in the back, point blank, 6 or 7 times, is reported to be paralyzed from the waist down. And while the family can hope that that's temporary, in my experience, once the paralysis sets in, it is rarely reversed. There are efforts with stem cells to address that, and I hope he's getting experimental stem cell treatments. But we're also learning that there's a history of tensions between Kenosha police and the city's black population. This is not the first incident of this type. So there were hundreds on the streets of Kenosha last night demanding justice for Jacob Blake. And there was a county-wide curfew that was announced. 125 National Guard troops were deployed by the governor. And they did enforce that with, just a little whiff of tear gas to try to clear the streets at 8:30 p.m. local time. Protests continue in Seattle, where police broke up a crowd of protesters on Capitol Hill Monday night after some threw fireworks at the East Precinct and started a fire outside the building. About 250 people had gathered, appearing to be more amped up, angry over the shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha. And they marched to the West Precinct and then back to the East Precinct, and along the way some smashed parking meters, they tagged buildings, they damaged an Amazon Go store, and broke windows of several Starbucks along their route. And at the West Precinct, which the city surrounded with cement barricades, some in the crowd spray-painted the building with "Burn Me" and other messages. The Seattle Times reports that throughout most of the protest, there was no visible police presence. I don't know if that's a strategy. When the group returned to the East Precinct, some began throwing fireworks at the building, started a fire behind a chain-link fence surrounding the precinct. And part of the remaining group set a small fire on nearby Pike Street before leaving the area. And a lot of these fires they're garbage fires. They're from garbage cans. And I believe that the risk and the level of threat that poses is highly exaggerated. Meanwhile, in Portland, another march on the police union headquarters drew a rapid police response Monday night. Oh, yeah, and they declared a riot. They waited a minute. Here's the report from the Oregonian. Officers arrived at the Portland Police Association building minutes after protesters declared the gathering an unlawful assembly as some in the crowd spray-painted the building and someone climbed on the roof to unfurl a banner. 1 minute later, police declared a riot. Now, I'm sorry. These little street fires, the unfurling of a banner, refusal of protesters to disperse, that's not a riot. But that's how it's developing on a nightly basis in Portland. One person was arrested Monday, accused of carrying a concealed weapon. Police said some who were arrested had weapons, including an electronic control weapon. What the hell is that? Electronic control weapon? I mean, it sounds like a garage door opener. Monday also marked the second consecutive demonstration in which police arrested about 24 people. Officers at times vocally cast doubt on some in the crowd who claimed to be press. At least one person was detained after failing to disperse or produce a press credential. Oh, and this in from Portland, the 25-year-old man, Marquise Love, who is suspected to have beaten another man and kicked his head. This incident occurred last weekend in Portland. He surrendered to police and was booked into the county detention center with bail of about $260,000. There's an interesting piece of investigative reporting at The Intercept today. It was actually posted yesterday under the byline of Aline Brown, and it shows once again that the FBI is targeting nonviolent, First Amendment, environmentalist protests, even some that haven't happened yet. They've been running red hat exercises, those are war games, at the Iowa Division of Intelligence in collaboration with the FBI's Omaha office and the local fusion center. And these fusion centers I've been highly critical of. They represent the vertical integration of law enforcement, the lily pad where local cops can secretly collaborate or collude with federal law enforcement agencies. And in this detailed report, it prints out at 28 pages. They show that the war games here all focus on protesters who are presumed to be violence prone, but we don't have evidence for that. The documents were obtained by The Intercept from Blue Leaks, which has captured a large trove of law enforcement documents hacked from government websites. And what it shows is that here's a quote from a critic who wrote a book called Pacifying the Homeland, Intelligence Fusion and Mass Supervision. And his name is Brendan McQuaid, University of Southern Maine. Quote, "It's paranoid threat inflation and totally indefensible depoliticization of what might be the most important political question of our time, which is, what are we going to do about climate change?" And the article liberally quotes Mike German, a man I respect. He's a former FBI agent now at the Brennan Center at NYU. He says, there are many entities out there at possible risk of some kind of criminal act, and yet you don't see community groups who are at a threat of white supremacy being invited by the FBI to talk about how they can protect themselves. They're spending security resources on hypothetical threats against favorite entities while ignoring real threats against other communities or private entities. There's more in the piece, and I recommend that you pick it up and read it when you have a chance. And climate change is evidenced by the wildfires that continue to burn with slightly better containment here in California today. It was really hazy. The air was toxic when I woke up this morning. We did have a layer of fog, which provided more humidity and calmed things down overnight. Midday, a breeze has picked up, and the air quality is better, but that breeze, of course, fans the flames of the fires. We now have 7 people who have died. 12,000 structures have been destroyed as of last night. 7,000 fires are still burning in California as of yesterday. One of the big fires, which is in Napa and Sonoma counties, has burned through 350,000 acres in the wine country, and it is now reported to be 25 to 27% contained. The fire southeast of San Francisco heading toward Silicon Valley is the second largest in California history at 360,000 acres. It's now described as 15% contained. You probably have heard about Scott Peterson. His case was the subject of a lot of tabloid coverage going back to 2002 and his trial here in the Bay Area in 2004. And yesterday, in a unanimous decision, the California Supreme Court overturned his death penalty while sustaining the underlying conviction. And I'm not, I haven't read the law. I'm not an attorney. But this seems a little incoherent to me, because the same jury sentenced Scott Peterson as the jury that convicted him. And if they find serious errors in the way the judge managed jury selection, but limit its taint to the penalty phase of the trial, I'm sorry, that doesn't make sense. Now, I'll be candid. I observed closely the proceedings of that trial in 2004, and I believe they created a strong circumstantial case that Scott Peterson murdered his pregnant wife around Christmas time in their kitchen, and then drove from Merced, which is more than an hour away, to San Francisco Bay on the Berkeley side, where it appears that he dropped their, it's one body with the baby inside, into the bay, because those remains came floating back up near the location where he had launched his boat. But a review of the case shows that there was no physical evidence that tied Scott Peterson to the murder of his wife. And the strongest element of the case was testimony by a woman named Amber Fry, who testified that she had started having an affair with Peterson about a month before Scott's wife, Lacey, was murdered and disappeared. So my view is that the prosecutors did not prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And I remain puzzled that the Supreme Court can overturn the death sentence while affirming the conviction for first-degree murder. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Great people like Abby McMillan, Marvin Rasmussen, Margaret Anderson, and Joe Carson. They each chip in $5, $10, $20 a month. I just bought a big box of paper. I print out, 120 pages a day to review for this podcast. And I appreciate that people help me out with the costs. And I've always imagined that someday I could make a living doing this. That hasn't really happened, but it doesn't deter me. Yesterday, we reported to you the sordid details of Jerry Falwell Jr.'s public confession that his wife had an affair, that's Becky, with a guy who's described as the pool boy. They met him at a pool next to a hotel. And apparently Becky was smitten and engaged in a years-long affair with a man who's been identified, but is he named in this article? I don't think so. Anyway, we also reported that the paramour of Becky Falwell went public, acknowledged that he had had the affair, and added sordid headlines or details to it, saying that on at least, he made it sound like on many occasions, that Jerry Falwell was a voyeur who watched the lovers in their pursuit of pleasure. And that makes him a voyeur and a cuckold. But Jerry Falwell Jr., let me read this to you. He said he wants to avoid giving credibility to the Reuters report that I cited yesterday that described him watching his wife have sex with the other man. He called that story 90% false. Okay. What's the 10% there, Jerry? So he has decided to yield to the pressure, acknowledging, I guess, his hypocrisy, and announced that he will be resigning. He's working on an exit payoff from Liberty University, which is founded by his daddy. And at tonight's Donald J. Trump-produced Republican National Convention, and Episode 1 was pretty slick. Powerful propaganda for people who are predisposed to embrace it. We know that Jerry Falwell Jr. will not be speaking. But last night, the Roman Catholic Cardinal of New York, Timothy Dolan, gave the invocation and, by implication, his blessing to the Trump administration. And Cardinal Dolan, you debase yourself in the Catholic Church by embracing a man who is fundamentally immoral. And you're embracing Stormy Daniels, immigrant children in cages, many other of the unchristian values demonstrated by Donald Trump. Oh, and Billy Graham Jr., he's going to speak to put that evangelical seal of approval on the Trumpster. We're also learning that in a new anti-Trump commercial, the former chief of staff of the Department of Homeland Security, Miles Taylor, has gone public with the allegation that when he went to the border with Trump in April of 2019, the president told senior leadership of Homeland Security behind the scenes that we should not let anyone else into the United States, even though he'd been told on repeated occasions that the way he wanted to do it was illegal. His response was to say, do it, and if you get in trouble, I'll pardon you. Does that affect the average Trump supporter? I don't think they care about things that are illegal. I don't think they care that Mike Pompeo is appearing on a video tonight from Jerusalem. The sitting Secretary of State has avoided the partisan taint of speaking to a convention for decades now. But Pompeo, ever the obedient Trump supporter, wants to serve up the move of our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and he wants to enhance his own political prospects for the future. Also, the use of the White House. Tonight it'll be the Rose Garden, where we're told Melania is going to give a beautiful speech. These violate protocols that have been in place for a long time, and a silly little law called the Hatch Act, which strictly prohibits political activities by members of the administration, people who are employed. So they're saying that when Ivanka speaks, it's just, daddy's little girl, not this White House volunteer. And Pompeo is violating a ban on every employee of the State Department participating in partisan politics. So here's the opening description of last night's show from the New York Times. President Trump and his political allies mounted a fierce and misleading defense of his political record on the first night of the Republican convention Monday, while unleashing a barrage of attacks on Biden and the Democratic Party that were unrelenting in their bleakness. And they're saying this because Trump had promised a positive vision, unlike the darkness of Joe Biden's infomercial last week. Here's paragraph 2. Hours after Republican delegates formally nominated Trump for a second term, the president and his party made plain they intend to engage in sweeping revisionism about Trump's management of the coronavirus pandemic. his record on race relations, and much else. And it was remarkable. I had to secretly watch these proceedings because Kathy, my partner, has decreed that I can't have it on when she is in the room. And despite the household ban on Republican propaganda, I managed to watch most of the speeches. And I was struck by how much they lie. They lie like Trump. They use the words that he uses at his mob rallies and in his tweets. And they do not flinch from just putting out information that is so exaggerated that you cannot call it true. And Donnie Trump Jr., who's a better speechmaker than I expected, he said that we have these stark choices between church, work, and school, and rioting, looting, and vandalism. No middle ground in Trump world. And the language was highly partisan. They missed no opportunity to attack unions, Democrats, link them with anarchists, rioters, and looters. And they tried to rewrite the entire history from earlier this year of Trump's reaction to COVID-19. And I'm sure it's going to succeed with some people. I have these Republican neighbors. And we asked, I call her Mrs. Trump. She said that Trump is managing the coronavirus pandemic perfectly. And then we asked where she gets her news, and she said, Fox, 24/7, baby. Matt Gaetz of Florida, the incendiary far-right congressman, making these descriptions of Biden and his radical running mate. They'll disarm you, empty the prisons, lock you in your home, and invite MS-13 to live next door. Now, this would be comical, and it is, but it's tragic, too, because there's so many people who are predisposed to believe this shit. And I think it does work to get Trump's base to nod like bobbleheads, clutch their guns and Bibles, and they will turn out, and they're going to vote. It's quite a challenge. Jamel Bowie has some good comments in the New York Times today. He said, the party has approved a resolution instead of a platform to enthusiastically support President Trump's America First agenda, whatever that may be. And while the White House has produced a bullet-point outline of its second-term agenda, this week's convention has little content planned other than cultural grievance and worshipful praise of the president. As one veteran congressional aide told Politico, the only thing Republicans believe now is owning the libs and pissing off the media. And it's true, they don't really care about policy. And they don't know that much about it. They're content with the one-liners that Trump utters to applause at his mob rallies and that he tweets out to approving, fawning supporters. And I will say that when I compare night one of the Republican infomercial to night one of the Democratic infomercial, both of which were trying to persuade you that their candidate is a decent human being who loves America and only has your interests at heart. Well, the whole style of the Democratic approach was one-to-one, talking to you in your living room, not shouting at a hall full or an imagined auditorium or convention center full of people. And the absolute worst was when Kimberly Guilfoyle spent 6 minutes yelling at us. And this is pretty embarrassing for people from San Francisco because Guilfoyle was once married to the now governor of California, Gavin Newsom, when he was our mayor. And then she, separated from him, ran off to New York, got a job at Fox News, where she exposed her hard right points of view. And She was delivering a speech that Trump probably wrote for her last night at the highest possible decibel level. One quote, "The same socialist policies which destroyed places like Cuba and Venezuela must not take root in our cities and our schools." And what we're seeing is the sense of entitlement enjoyed by wealthy white people who identify with Republican politics because they've got theirs. And they don't care about the people being left behind who are going to start being evicted in September, about the crushing weight of being unemployed and having no savings, relying on paltry unemployment benefits that often do not arrive. They don't care about the children who are going hungry and more who will fall into food insecurity in the very near future. They are content just to attack Democrats, falsely paint them as extreme socialist, communist, coming for your guns. And as I say, the sad thing is it works with far too many people. Here's a description from one of the squibs in the New York Times. At times, the speakers and pre-recorded videos appear to be describing an alternate reality, one in which the nation was not nearing 180,000 dead from the virus, in which Trump had not consistently ignored serious warnings about the disease, in which the president had not spent much of his term appealing openly to xenophobia and racial animus, and in which someone other than Trump had presided over an economy that began crumbling in the spring. And when they trot out Herschel Walker, the retired football player, who knew how to carry the ball for 7 yards straight up the middle of the field every time, we have to suspect some long-term brain damage for his embrace of Trump, and as an African American, clearing Trump of racism. Oh, and here's a comment from the New York Times television critic James Poniewozik. The decibel champion of the night was Kimberly Guilfoyle, the former Fox News host whose delivery threatened to make America deaf again. In a tinnitus-tempting five-alarm blare, she warned about enemies who want to enslave you to the weak, dependent, liberal, victim ideology to the point that you will not recognize this country or yourself. And the victim ideology was on full display. That's the whole Republican game. They are victims of liberals, of minorities, people who want a share of power, and they depict them as wanting to take over. And I have in front of me a printout 18 pages long of the New York Times fact-checking of some of the comments, they couldn't capture them all, that were expressed last night. Like Don Jr. saying, courtesy of the Chinese Communist Party, the virus struck. The president quickly took action and shut down travel from China. He also claimed anarchists have been flooding our streets and Democrat mayors are ordering the police to stand down. And I really don't have the appetite to feed you any more of it. I think you get the point, that they lie compulsively, repeatedly, and every time they move those lips. Here's today's COVID-19 update, prepared by Linda Lewis. Worldwide, 23.7 million confirmed cases of the virus. Total deaths now at almost 815,000. Here in the U.S., the death toll is reported at 177,000, close to 178. Yesterday, 40,000 new cases reported, 500 deaths. CNN reports that rolling hotspots are the new normal as cases recede in the Sun Belt but grow in the Midwest. So in the South, I think you can follow these numbers. The 7-day average of new cases per 100,000 people dropped from 22.6 on August 5th to 19% August 12th. It's not percent, it's per 100,000, sorry. 16 on August 19th. And the percentage change in daily new cases fell each week compared to the week before by at least 10%. But in the Midwest, the numbers for August showed that they're headed in the opposite direction. The 7-day average of new cases per 100,000 dropped from 13 to 12 between August 5th and August 12th. Then it rose to 13.5 on August 19th. And so there is now more attention being paid to states in the Midwest. University of Alabama Monday reported 566 new cases at its campuses and facilities since classes began less than a week earlier. 500 plus of the cases identified at the main campus in Tuscaloosa. Another 300 students tested positive prior to August 19th as they returned to school. And a university spokeswoman said that many students have chosen to go home to recuperate. Yesterday, we reported on the novel case from Hong Kong of a man who had the coronavirus, was declared free of it, and now has a second case. Belgian virologist Mark van Ranst said there is a new case in Belgium, a woman who had contracted COVID-19 in March and then again in June. He sits on some Belgian COVID-19 committees, and he said cases like this, her symptoms were relatively mild, and the body may not have created enough antibodies to prevent reinfection. The Dutch patient was an older person with a weakened immune system, and virologist Marion Koopman says that cases where people have been sick with the virus a long time and then it flares up again are better known. But a true reinfection, as these three cases, Hong Kong, Belgium, and Holland, required genetic testing of the virus in both the first and second infection. And at the University of Exeter, chair of the British Medical Association, David Strain, said the cases were worrying for several reasons. The first is it suggests that previous infection is not protective. The second is it raises the possibility that vaccinations may not provide the hope that we have been waiting for. Well, Sunday I watched in moderate alarm as the Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, Stephen Hahn, allowed Donald Trump to feed him language, and he announced, and Trump seconded, what they called a breakthrough using plasma, convalescent plasma from patients who have, like the three who got reinfected, recovered from the coronavirus. It's essentially the antibodies being transferred from a person who previously had it to somebody who's just caught it. And I believe that antibodies, have potential. But like those three cases, we don't know how effective they are and how long they last. But Stephen Hahn really discredited himself, because without announcing any new data, and all of this stuff had been reviewed on Friday, but by Sunday, after being tweeted into submission by the president, Hahn was up there just singing the song that Trump was calling. So he has recently tweeted, Hahn has, "I've been criticized for remarks I made Sunday about the benefits of convalescent plasma. The criticism is entirely justified. What I should have said better is that the data show a relative risk reduction and not an absolute risk reduction." He said a reduction of fatalities of 35%. And according to the Associated Press, the FDA made the decision based on data the Mayo Clinic collected from hospitals around the country that were using plasma on patients in wildly varying ways. There's no comparison group of untreated patients, meaning no conclusions can be drawn about overall survival. People who received plasma with the highest levels of antibodies fared better than those given plasma with fewer antibodies. And Peter Navarro, who's nominally a trade advisor to Trump, he jumped into this conversation saying that it's a crazy talking point related to recommendations from health experts that the plasma needs to undergo a randomized trial before receiving an emergency authorization. Navarro said the odds of this being able to hurt you are close to zero, so it's safe. The odds of it being able to help you are close to 100%. And in a separate article I have here from the New York Times, Trump on Sunday called it a tremendous number, the 35%. And so did Alex Azar, the former pharma executive who plays Health and Human Services Secretary. But scientists were taken aback by the way the administration framed the data, which appeared to be calculated based on a small subgroup of hospitalized patients in a Mayo Clinic study. Those who were under 80 years old, not on ventilators, and receiving plasma known to contain high levels of virus-fighting antibodies introduced within 3 days of diagnosis. And many experts, including a scientist at the Mayo Clinic who worked on that study, were bewildered about where the statistic came from. Dr. Walid Gilad, who heads the Center for Pharmaceutical Policy and Prescribing at the University of Pittsburgh, quote, "For the first time ever, I feel like official people in communications and people at the FDA grossly misrepresented data about this therapy." And here's one of those bizarre stories that will promote the notion that wearing masks is a stupid idea. And let me just restate that I don't think wearing masks is, 100% universally effective. And I do think that there is some sorts of social control being imposed, but I don't see it as onerous. I think it's to remind people that there's a virus lurking out there and you don't want to get it. And as we know, my mask prevents me from spewing the viral aerosols on you. It doesn't really prevent me from ingesting them, or at least not in any serious way. So on a JetBlue flight, a mom who had multiple kids with her, including her 2-year-old daughter, had difficulty getting the 2-year-old to keep her mask on. And so the flight crew came by, and they told her to gather her things because she had to get off the plane. And the woman here, Chaya Bruck, said, I told them I could try, but she kept pulling it off. What should I do, tie her hands? The entire flight was eventually forced to remove their cabin baggage and deplane. And Bruck said they were horribly nasty. My kids were crying. And Linda reports that JetBlue's mask policy changed between the time that the woman booked her flight and when she boarded. Because it used to say that small children who cannot maintain a face covering are exempt. And even the World Health Organization guidelines say that children under 5 should not be required to wear masks. So I think this is overkill. And it only fuels the skeptics and the people who are refusing to wear a mask. And I think they got to get a grip on that. One of my favorite performers, Van Morrison, is upset because his performances have been largely canceled this year. He is due to perform in England in September at a socially distanced gig, but he appears to be one of the few singers or performers who's gone public with his opposition. He denounced the pseudoscience around coronavirus. He's trying to rally musicians in a campaign to restore live music concerts. And I feel the pain. I have friends who work as roadies and technicians, and their incomes have just been reduced to zero this year. There are a lot of people who aren't stars who are impacted by the pandemic rules that prevent most live performances. So I didn't know this either. Van Morrison was knighted in 2016, so let's all salute Sir Van. He said, this is not a sign of compliance or acceptance of the current state of affairs. That is performing at this upcoming concert in England. He said, "This is to get my band up and running and out of the doldrums. This is also not the answer going forward. We need to be playing to full capacity audiences in the future." And one more story in the COVID file today. In the first lawsuit of its kind, a Florida judge has ruled that the state's requirement that public schools provide in-person instruction violates the Florida Constitution because it arbitrarily disregards safety and denies local school boards the ability to decide when students can safely return. This is a victory for teachers' unions and a loss for Governor Ron DeSantis. The state's order required that school districts give students the option to go back in person by August 31st or risk losing crucial state funding. An exemption was made only for Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm counties, which have been the hardest hit by the virus and plan to start the school year online. And the state has, of course, filed an appeal. A couple of stories to bring to your attention before I wrap up today. At Mondo Weiss, under the byline of Donald Johnson, 5 points about Russiagate. And Johnson opens by saying, "I don't know what the truth is, but even if it is true in exactly the way the New York Times says, it seems relatively trivial and not as important as many people say it is, even skeptics." He makes 5 quick points. Americans lie to each other far more than the Russians lie to us. 2. If we want to talk about foreign influence, be serious. Israel and the Saudis do it far more and with more consequences both for our politics and for the lives of innocent people overseas. Amen to that. Number 3. What we do to others, even including Russia, is far worse than what they supposedly did to us. Can't argue. Number 4. Russiagate was used to gloss over what the emails sent to WikiLeaks actually revealed: the inner workings of the Democrats. For instance, they exposed the ways that Benjamin Netanyahu and his major donor, Haim Saban, were shown to have coordinated candidate Hillary's stance on the BDS campaign in 2016. And 5th, Russiagate is an excuse to ramp up a new Cold War. That's why so many national security types love it. Oh, there's a 6th when I turn the page here. Russiagate gives liberals a reason to ignore the harm Trump does to civilians in countries whose governments are allied to Russia. So we impose brutal sanctions on Venezuela, Iran, and Syria, and this hurts civilians. And Ray McGovern, my good friend who is turning 81 this week, and a former CIA analyst, he has a detailed piece at Consortium News dated August 21st, which runs down the false claims of the Russiagate narrative, the Mueller report, the way the New York Times refuses to correct its reporting, even as new testimony shows, for example, that CrowdStrike admitted that it wasn't able to prove that anybody got into DNC servers and pulled anything out. And he goes on to talk about the recent Senate Intelligence Committee report, which makes assertions that it doesn't prove, including the alleged extensive evidence of contacts between Trump campaign advisors and people tied to the Kremlin. But neither Mueller nor the Intelligence Committee proved that those contacts led to any kind of criminal behavior. So I think it's a very well-written piece. And if you are not up to speed on those of us who don't believe the Russiagate narrative, I highly recommend it. And finally today, I want to bid farewell to Gail Sheehy, journalist and author, who I interviewed on several occasions, particularly after her really good book about Gorbachev. Her best-known book was Passages, way back in 1976, examining the predictable crises of adult life. It was truly seminal. She was 83 and died in Southampton, New York. She had been married to Clay Felker, the publisher of the New York magazine. He also served as her editor, and Felker died several years ago, and Gail Sheehy passed away from complications of pneumonia yesterday. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.